So I recently started watching a few of Matt Dillahunty's videos, which is funny because I've known about him for years and I'd never gone to his channel. I've only seen clips from the Atheist Experience on various other sources. But I decided to watch some of his videos. The end of September, he made a video addressing the problem of evil. Now, honestly, I went in expecting him to present the problem of evil, to talk about maybe some theodicies or some defenses against it, and then to maybe criticize those. Instead, he did a little bit of that, but what I got from it primarily was that he was just conveying how he finds the problem of evil to be a weak argument. And while I agree that there's holes that can be poked in it, because I've made a video on the subject, I think that his reasons for thinking that it's weak are themselves weak. I think he kind of just throws his hands up in the air because maybe he's debated with Christian apologists who just wouldn't budge, and they would just do the hand waving of God works in mysterious ways and we don't understand the big plan that God has, implying that somehow God is allowing for evil or suffering in order to get to that big plan, that scheme, that whatever. I think that that's just a cop-out answer, and even Dillahunty himself recognizes that it's a non-answer. So his position that it's a weak argument seems less based on the logic itself and more based on it being pragmatic or not. He doesn't find it that it works. But honestly, can anybody name one argument against the existence of God that actually sways a strong believer? At least, at the very least, it doesn't happen right then. Hardly anybody just goes, "Oh, you're right. I really got to rethink my whole life now." They argue against it, and then maybe over time they hear the arguments again, and they look into it, and then they start changing their mind, and they become, different. They have a different outlook over time. That's generally how people work. So I don't know. I find that he kind of just threw his hands up and decided that it wasn't a good argument because it didn't do what any of the arguments also don't do. But then he kind of used that, bringing up the problem of evil, as a springboard to talk about divine hiddenness. And I kind of wanted to address that a little bit. One of the things he talks about is the idea, okay, so God's hidden, and the idea is that if you pray hard enough, if you're sincere enough, God will reveal himself to you. So when you have that frustration, that why hasn't God revealed himself? The other person just says, "Oh, your faith isn't sincere enough. You just have to have sincere faith." That's not an answer that you're going to get from somebody who genuinely has divine revelation, because that's just a faith-shaming tactic. It's detrimental. It doesn't help the other person. If they really cared about you and they felt like it was necessary for you to understand God and to try to love God, and that was important, they wouldn't give you that faith-shaming answer. The reason they do it, and I'm just going to say this, I'm going to apply it to everybody that does it. I'm not even, somebody can come out and say, "Oh, not all people that do it are saying that or are that way." But I'm just going to say it anyway. It's pious fraud. They're saying it because they need to be convinced themselves, and the person that helped convert them and guided them toward that was saying it to them. And it's just a whole bunch of people faith-shaming each other under false pretenses. They don't actually have revelation of God. They have a concept of God, and they want to make themselves feel special and convince themselves. So they tell the next person, "Oh, well, you don't have it because you don't have the special faith. I do. I have the special faith. God loves me." And so the other person does one of two things. The other person either gets frustrated and says, "Screw you guys," and becomes an atheist. Or they decide to play along and become part of the faith-shaming, pious fraud squad. Right? That's what they do. And so people that act like that and talk in that way, they're, at best, and this is being as nice as I can be, they're neophyte. Even if they're, in some roundabout way, their heart's in the right place, and they're also trying to understand God, they're not being sincere about it themselves by saying that. So that's the big irony, is that they're telling you you're not sincere enough in your faith when they themselves aren't sincere. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. The other thing is, he talks about the reasons why, or the reasons for why God is hidden according to generally Christian apologists. And he does preface his video to say that this is a problem for most Christians. I'm not a Christian, per se. So I will preface my explanation by saying I'm not a Christian, that my argument for the reasons why God seems to be hidden from us doesn't necessarily apply to Christianity, and so doesn't necessarily rebut what Matt's saying. I will say, however, that even if Christians don't agree that my answer applies to them, I would say that they're wrong. And I won't go into those reasons. I can do that if somebody asks. We can talk about that. But just suffice to say, I'm saying right now that I'm not a Christian, so my answer to why God is hidden isn't necessarily going to apply to Christianity. The problem with Christianity is the same problem with the problem of evil. In Christianity, God creates everybody in advance, knowing in advance that they are going to do evil and sin. So the idea is that God is hidden because of sin and because of free will, right? So, but the problem with that is that God created the beings who in turn caused the evil and the sin, and he knew that they were going to do that. So the hiddenness is ultimately his responsibility. And then on top of that, you have the issue that, wait a minute, if the world has suffering and people have free will, and the answer is that, people need free will, and that's why suffering exists, yet there's a place called heaven where people allegedly have free will, and there's no suffering, then you have an example in the Bible, I don't know, depends on, I suppose, the interpretation maybe. I'll leave it open to that. But let's say just generally, theists, Abrahamic theists, even I'm a theist who believes in a version sort of heaven. And I can get into that in another video. But if you have an idea, if you have a concept of a place where there's no suffering and there's free will, then you now have no excuse whatsoever. The question is, why didn't God just have that place exist with all the people being happy and never had suffering? So they can't explain it because they have to ultimately go back to a God that creates everything and knows that it's going to happen. Whereas I'm saying there's hiddenness and there's evil because God created a world not on his own desires, but on the desires of other eternal beings. Eternal. They didn't exist, or they didn't ever not exist. They were always existing, like God, but they are fallible. So the idea is that God simply supplies the desires. The general desire for why the universe exists in the first place is to enjoy apart from God. That's essentially what it comes down to. These eternal beings desired a world in which they have the facility to try to enjoy themselves and be their own miniature gods, separate from God, obviously. And that necessitated an apparent absence of God. And that's ultimately the answer. That's the answer to divine hiddenness. It's not necessarily an answer that... Obviously, it's not an answer that helps anybody to go, oh, that makes sense, and now I believe in God. It's just like the problem of evil. If I can dispel the problem of evil, if I can dispel the problem of divine hiddenness, if I can find a reasoning a way out of it, doesn't prove God's existence. So I'm not under any illusions that this video is doing that at all. Definitely doesn't prove God's existence. But there are reasons out of these things. They just might not be Christian reasons. So yeah, I just think it's funny because the whole Christian argument against hiddenness, or to explain hiddenness, is predicated on the idea that God just whimsically decides to create stuff, and they don't even think about how that affects any of their arguments. All their arguments down the line are affected by that. It's the core issue with any theological position. It's just across the board. I make these videos on YouTube. You're going to see me refer to it again and again because it always comes down to the question of why might a being such as God create anything at all? You have to tackle that question before you answer anything else. And I like that Matt mentioned that. He mentioned that question in regard to a book he's writing. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I might actually want to read the book if he's talking about that. But yeah, I think there are answers, potentially, but they might not be the answers that some certain types of theists like. Anyway, that's all. I actually made a video really soon after the last video, which is very unlike me. So I'm hoping I get that momentum going, keep it going, and I find more content to address. And yeah, catch you later.